Hello, everyone, and welcome to Writers Drinking Coffee. This is a podcast where writers sit around drinking tasty beverages to talk about writing, publishing, and the whole creative process. There will be rants and raves and opinions that may not agree but are lovingly delivered. We will not censor ourselves, so consider us PG-13. I am your host today, Jeannie Warner. This is episode 212, The Operative Returns. Welcome back to L. Douglas Garrett.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I hope you all remember Douglas, his Remember the Trade series, and his operative, shall we call him Dave?
I think we can call David Cox.
We're also here to welcome back Nikki, well, for the first time for some of you, Nikki Robinson, in order to squee with enthusiasm at the release of their latest compilation, Remember the Dead. Now, this is the prequel you've all been waiting for, and I am bursting with some questions, so I'm very excited about this. First of all, what took you so long? I've missed you. It's been almost 4.5 years.
It has, in fact, been nearly 5. It was a tragic shutdown. First of our ability to move and work together, and second of all, with our time of being available between the COVID situation and people's employment becoming local, small world, Nikki working at her job in the Bay Area, and my working only in a very narrow area around where I was living, and writing disappeared.
That was a bit of a leitmotif from when COVID fell for all of us, that we were very productive and very enthusiastic, and yet somehow the very zeitgeist got in our way. Did you feel that at all, or was it
Very much so. I'm an inveterate reader. I've read hundreds of books a year since I was a kid, and all of a sudden I couldn't read, much less write. I read nothing for probably 1.5 years. I mean, nothing aside from, the back of a milk carton.
So what kicked you? What got you moving again, Douglas?
Well, I was really fortunate to have 2 things line up about the same time. Most of the other obligations in my life stopped being real obligations. I had a lot more ability to choose, and almost to the month, Nikki, who had been my editor and direct contributor in the earlier works, had freed up from things and had actually put up her "I'm retired" flag.
Yay, retirement.
And so suddenly I had somebody who I could collaborate with on an hours-a-day basis and make it an actual co-authorship operation.
Yay! Well, I love military fiction generally. I've loved it since David Drake's hover tanks and Richard Sharp slogging through the fields of Spain. So one of the things that I really like in your books is that you do throw technical terms, but you at least stop and define them first. I think there's way too many people that say, oh yeah, we took out some ATVs. And not everybody understands that ATV stands for all-terrain vehicle, but at least you guys, thank you, as make it consistent enough that I understand all of your special operative phrases and your 3 initial acronyms, which make me mad, I'm sure, sometimes, but at the same time are tremendously useful for getting a lot of information. So I have a question about the writing of prequels. Were these shorts written prior to your novellas, or were they later, or did they just pop up saying, hey, I can see my guy in LA as a roadie, or where did they come from?
Well, would you like me to handle this one?
Would you handle that one?
So I had 4 of the short stories that were available as a concept works for the compilation, for the collection. And the outline of the novella that becomes the singular piece at the beginning, on the back burner, unedited, dating back to the time between the first novella, which is set in '83 in Los Angeles, and references a bunch of stuff in hindsight.
It does.
So I had the various little shorts and notes about things that were referenced in hindsight. We then went on to write a novel which goes into '84 and had never gone back to revisit. So one of the things we thought about doing was the best way to get back to production writing was to create a home for the original novella getting into a paperback and it being the end piece of a larger collection.
Right.
And we reached into the archive and said, well, here are some shorts and I want to write a new novella. So I'm gonna write a big one.
And I do love it, although I especially love it because I just went on a lovely vacation to Costa Rica and I had deep empathy for your character because I have just tried driving on a perfectly well-maintained road in 2025 from one place to another. And there were moments where we were in low gear 4-wheel drive mode and trying not to kill anybody as we were going up and down different places. And I can only feel empathy for when that young man looks at a map in Central America and says, "Oh, don't worry, you only have to go 80 miles." I mean,
It's a really long 80 miles.
I read this in Costa Rica and I burst out laughing in the middle of the night. My speedy's like, "What are you laughing at?" I'm like, "It's only 80 miles. Somebody from the Bay Area in California will say, "Oh, that's 2.5 hours, depending on rush hour." Oh,
Right,
no.
2.5 weeks.
Oh, no.
Oh my God. And there were so few ways to make use of roads of any real quality. Proper macadam, all-weather roads, the National Road Network in Colombia that's described as part of the Remember the Dead, sort of the March of the 10,000 part of that story. We don't actually get to spend a lot of time on the hardtops. So it's even worse than what you're describing.
There was a place where there was a landslide, which one could see. They had more, I think, road crew I saw than police and anything else all put together, just because it rains a lot more in Central America than it does here in California. And one could see that of all of these beautiful roads running through, there's shit that slides down into them all the time. And so when you are also describing these guys carrying with slings, so going up these up and down hills and dales, carrying a body between them, I just want you to know that I felt very, very bad for your guys.
Oh, the sympathy is appreciated. I will throw in real quickly here that one of the things about fictionalizing to make a story of it was I really wanted to remain faithful to the incredible efforts that so many of the team members made, really above and beyond what could be expected of them in that situation.
Yes.
So long as they had other teammates, they were helping by doing it. And I really wanted to be right by those guys. And, tell their story with the modern saying of this is tell the story with honor.
I think that did that. Now, how did you decide the order? Because I noticed that the short stories weren't all, strictly speaking, chronological. And you did say, this is 1980, this is 76, this is 78,
Yes. So the way that came about, the original order was strictly in chronological order, which means the main novella, Remember the Dead, was not the first thing. The very first thing was the very first, idea of even having the project. And so one of our beta readers read through the whole thing and they kept saying, "But I don't understand. Why are you referencing this when so much later this happens?"
Right.
And so we realized that the best way to structure it was the novellas bracketing the whole thing. And then it was mostly, but not exclusively, chronological order between them. But it meant that a lot of the characters in the story and whatnot was at the very beginning. And so there were no questions later about why are we even talking about this? And then at that point, we had to put years on it as opposed to just it being in the story.
And I like that because throughout the novellas, it is very much a soldier's point of view and a very factual what happened when, what order. And the novellas, the shorter stories give us a little bit more that I loved and liked about the psyche of the guy, especially forming identities of who is he? Like, are there new personalities? And especially the concept of what is useful for him in his life. Now, this makes him a little even more transactional than the guys asked do they want a dog or a woman in the middle of the forest. And, and their responses, as we all know out there, was they wanted the dog because the dog could do all these useful things for them. So it's a very transactional way of thinking, but it's survival, isn't it, in its own way?
It's an extraordinarily useful skill, to use the word useful on the other side of the ledger. To be able to be the first person being ruthless in a situation.
That's fair.
That said, it is probably the least sociable behavior to bring home with you.
I would say that is definitely true, and I've known a few C-suite here and there in the world that are maybe a little bit too transactional in that same general idea. But the concept of the intermezzo, I very much liked that you just have that, yes, here's what happened that you referenced from Remember When. Like, yes, that is cool to kind of get that fleshed out. But that little intermezzo piece in there I thought was neat, so I liked that you put it, and I understand now, that makes sense of that takes us a little bit further back to how did our David develop who he is. I also like the names you used.
Did you now?
In the opening, there's a delightful thing where a character that we learn to not like is reading the names, and it almost has something that we used for hockey jerseys, number 13 expendable, number 14 expendable, as they were clearly a bunch of John Smiths and made up names. And I'm not going to give it all away because one of them made me laugh out loud. So thank you.
Good.
You're very welcome.
Now, because I am a deep and devoted scholar, I loved your reference to the executive order for 11905. For those of you that do not recall executive orders from, decades past, that was one where the America said, hey, we're not going to do political assassinations, which didn't really age well when you think of SEAL Team 6 and all, but you do refer to that. And I liked that because it made it even more real. Now, I'm going to pretend that you're David in all of this, and all of this happened to you. But
Oh boy, that's a big pretense.
But that's what we do. I mean, David Drake said he was drafted out of law school and he went off to run tanks across, Europe. So he wrote about tanks. He just put it in space. So, you can put yours down in Central America. And I loved that.
There are some very funny bits of that crossover. One of my good friends who was a follow-on reader right after publication to tell us how it looked as it came out, pulled me aside at the end of it and he says, I saw this, I saw the other. I didn't know you spoke Spanish. And it was like wait a minute, Fred, buddy. There's a little distinction here between people I knew that inspired my stories and please don't ask me to have a conversation in Spanish.
Yes. I had a boss that learned to speak Czech because he graduated from high school and then went to the army and then ended up sitting near the Czech Republic during the Velvet Revolution listening to computers such. And another friend went to DLI and he wanted to speak Russian and they gave him what is now Myanmar. So he learned to speak that and to go listen on. So I understand that one doesn't always get to choose, right?
No.
No. Again, you get what is useful to your employer, and your employer happens to be the United States government in this instance for this guy. There is also something cool, an international code of conduct for private security service providers. And I enjoyed your statement of how that seemed to be played with a little fast and loose in places, but that was sort of in the above the operant level to the shenanigans of the we don't like that guy and that guy goes away. So I enjoyed that because, again, you made it very realistic.
And there's so much in the transition years between the 80s and the 90s as things became more formalized. And the conventions you're speaking of in particular were the agreements of the first really established professional military companies or contractors.
Right. I suppose in a strange way, we can look back and say, is that kind of, that's the Swiss Guard way back and they got loaned to the Pope, right? I mean, this is an old profession, the idea of it, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the interests of industries in organizing their own military force when they were in places where sovereignty didn't provide the military force is a very long-running thing.
Is that where you get we know that Pinkertons became a private and then also a security force. I had a friend who was a Pinkerton, what did you do for them? He said, mostly I sat in a yard and watched a bunch of copper sit there and not get stolen.
There you go. But the 19th century late period of Pinkertons, they were so effective as both a security service and as a paramilitary arm that they were commonly called into duty, including they were the original armed Secret Service men.
Oh, interesting.
Attached to Lincoln's Pinkertons during the American Civil War were supposed to be what kept him alive. By the way, the war was over and they weren't around when things went bad. How was the play, Mrs. Lincoln?
Well, we understand the Pinkertons were also involved with the National Guard and the Homestead Massacre when that happened. So that was 1892.
Right. It all will sort out as far as what the Americans allowed companies to own in the way of armed security forces around the 1920s.
Now, you referred once to the term Safari Club and patronage versus private military contractors. Can you expound upon that a little bit? Because many people listening may not know that.
So the history of the modern mercenary is usually surrounded with the idea of post-colonial former Belgian paratroopers hired to guard copper mines in Katanga during the conflict. And that, in fact, was about what the case was. Company-level formations of World War II vets that were put into service under the guise of some corporate mining industry or some big banker somewhere. But those then became tools of state, hired by state entities that wanted them. And one of the first ways that started happening in an organized manner was when intelligence services couldn't really afford their own, special activities division. And so they pooled their resources to get enough pull, influence, and connections to hire a company of mercenary commandos all together. The Safari Club is an amazing example of four second-rate and lower intelligence services basically deciding that making sure the important industries in what would be the new country of Zaire were appropriately protected against people who wanted to, shall we say, distribute the wealth of the country.
I think that's a fair way to put it. We all watched, and those who watch the news are aware of Wagner Group all over Africa mostly.
The transition period was really interesting, and it's worth commenting because companies started going back to having their own military consultants. But they weren't large formations. And you come out of the 70s with men like Ross Perot and his electronic data systems contractors responsible for securing his personnel when assigned outside the United States. And two of his contractors famously led the rescue of EDS staff personnel from Iran during the Khomeini Revolution.
Right, the On the Wings of Eagles.
Yes.
Right.
So you end up with these organizational structures that are individuals or relationships with an individual who could recruit a company of men, an extra platoon of volunteers to go to Rhodesia and join the light infantry, whatever. And these became more organized entities. First, the companies would have parts that would organize these groups. And what is fictionalized in my writing is in this transition period. It's interested private citizens with government connections across several countries, using those connections to allow themselves to have a very modest but highly deniable contractable force of mercenaries and spies that they then make available to the countries that are on their side philosophically. They're defending an agenda.
I mean, I feel like I could do that.
Well, for one thing,
I'm pretty good at recruiting people, right?
You are.
Yeah. And, there's a certain future for it. But as I'm going to say, the biggest problem with it, of course, is eventually governments always want to do it better themselves, or there are people who have decided that the way of doing it is a business unto itself. So by the time you get to the 90s, you're now facing countries deciding to restrict what mercenary activity is even legal. The African Union attempt to get a treaty through the UN to ban mercenary activity, which it got ratified and got ignored. And fairly shortly thereafter, you have your executive outcomes. Former Commander Prince's
that would be Blackwater, which got, I love it because I got to say, Blackwater got renamed Academy / She Services, XC.
XC. Yeah, they've
and then
rebranded
the
a few
Constellus
times.
Holdings. And I just saw that when I looked this up, because I wanted to ask you, was David now working for Apollo Global Management, Louise?
Well, if he was still in the business 25 more years than he was, yes, he would have been.
That was what I was wondering. So cool.
Yeah. Can I do one little spoiler for the future?
Sure.
So one of the things in the book that we're writing now, which is called Remember How, set not too far in the future from the last one, is that the planner, Conway, is sitting there thinking to himself, could we be looking in a mirror? Is there somebody, do the Russians have a project of their own?
Of course they do.
Yeah. Well, maybe they do, maybe they don't. But it's the nightmare scenario of a lot of the people in the project is there's somebody on the other side, not just all these other disconnected people we're dealing with.
I honestly just presumed by this point that the Wagner Group was owned and run by GRU.
Well,
so
you've got a good approach there. The problem, of course, is synchronicity, the timing.
Yes.
So by the time the fictionalized project and real things of its ilk have played out, that's the early 90s.
Right.
The Yeltsin era in Russia has just begun. And what you've got from that is the ability for the first time for oligarchical interests to actually formulate their own fighting forces and supplies of leftover weaponry and permissions to move things. And so good old, he's back there now because we traded for him, Victor Bolt, made his entire career on being the air transporter for all of that.
Yes.
But honestly, we'll see it reach its high point when the mirror to your Blackwaters is allowed to evolve in the Putin era Russia, and that's where Prigozhin and the Wagner.
I like it, but I sort of had a question on where are they going to get the money? I mean, that's the core of it, isn't it? I mean, I understand that Apollo Global Management, they own a bunch of grocery stores. You visited them, people. They're smart and final,
Which is just
I think they own Qdoba and some restaurant services out there. Oh, and by the way, this mercenary unit, international. So, but the fact that they've made so much money on the transactions of land and holdings and money, and I think they've bought a bunch of Irish debt to administer that way. So that's my one thing is like, how in the land of cryptocurrency are you going to limit what Russia gets to buy for their mercenaries?
Sure, and if you look at the current Sahel bloc, which are 4 of the countries in West and Central Africa that have undergone military coups to get them out of French post-colonial regimes, the first objective of every one of those revolts has been to seize the raw material sources for hard currency sellable items to immediately put them under contract to the Africa Corps. What an interesting name choice for a new Wagner. Anyway, and fund them by the direct sales. So Burkina Faso can still sell gold on the world market when Russia can't.
Right.
Yet that hard currency goes into the right pockets anyway.
Well, that's, all they have to do is sell a few NFTs and you can move. One of the interesting ways, how do you move a lot of money across borders? And, when you're looking at they're trying to crack some of the drug lords now, and I'm seeing huge amounts of it they're now moving to. Didn't El Salvador recently say they were going to entirely cryptocurrency?
They're going to an entirely crypto basis for one of their currency definitions.
Yes. Yeah. So,
and now to look back at novellas we've already put out, the sub-story, the story behind the original novella, Remember When, was that one of the Colombian drug lords had figured out a way to get Panama to accept his American dollars and launder them for him. So everybody else was still having to bundle their dollar bills and fly them back to Colombia. And he had the scam going that was going to make him the next Lord of Los Angeles cocaine trading.
I love the way it is. And the thing I love through all of it is through over the years, you beautifully wove into all of the U.S. meddling in some of our foreign South trade and world trade and policy and how it moves there, because you make it in a way simple that I'm just a guy going to a place to do a thing, like I'd never been to Belize, is the words of Ocean's 11. But at the same time, it creates an interesting way to educate the world about how the world works. Because we can say it's fiction, but it's a speculative, recent past fiction that was probably true.
In some of the cases, we've had the luxury of being able to weave very specific, real historical events that have been in many ways overlooked, or at least minimized in certain areas.
Or declassified.
And later times declassified, exactly. The one I will point that I'm a little bit proud of is in these short stories we're telling, I got to tell one right when the fictionalized teams were first being deployed. Can you guys work like special forces scouting teams out there doing operational level reconnaissance? And where are they sent? Are they sent to go find the Cuban secret? No. Are they sent to discover the Russian? No. They are sent into Guatemala to see the American allies massacring their countryside in the name of fighting communists, and document it and bring it home and tell somebody in the American government, hey, we're backing the wrong guys.
There are many people that are, I would call it culturally conservative, that if you say the Iran-Contra scandal, don't really know the details. They don't realize that, hey, we're going to give a bunch of money to the Ayatollah Khomeini and Hezbollah so that they will release some American people that were captured and put in Lebanon. And then what we really want is them to give that money down to some Sandinistas in Nicaragua.
Well, please, the good Colonel North had the observation that just if Khashoggi managed to deliver all of those in particular Hawk anti-aircraft missiles, to the Iranians, they'd be so happy that there'd be this pile of cash delivered that we didn't necessarily have to report back to the U.S. Congress we had gotten.
Right.
So as long as it's still on the balance sheets, let's redirect it. And he had various other ongoing operations regarding the really bleeding wound of what Nicaragua had become.
Yeah.
And reached into that purse to solve it. The fact that he did so entirely criminally, and here's the real kisser on this. One of the short stories in the collection, we talk about Cuban exiles.
Yes.
Did you notice who was the leader under arrest in Venezuela who was unavailable to lead the Cuban exiles? And so the former CIA guy came in to influence them. But Carriles was sitting in jail at the time.
Right.
You might notice the name Carriles show up again in El Salvador 8 years later, 7 years later, dealing with providing airplanes to drop supplies to the Contras. And
So where are you going next? What's the next one in the series for us so that we can eagerly look into the, shall we call it, world powers behaving badly?
yeah, exactly. I would say that where we're going next, which is with the new novel project, it's a little over the 1/3 point of full production and about halfway along the manuscript course. It's an effort to do another novel, single major arc novel, and it's told in a series of rapidly sequential operations.
Okay.
So in Remember Them, we wrote a single operation with a large setup, but a lot of precursor activities in country. This one, we have a single small mission, mostly intelligence gathering, a little bit of a caper. To get a piece of information, we have lots of time to set it up, to have the right mindset, to have the right agents prepared to go in, crisp and clean, get out. Even though the plan's pretty thin, everybody's well prepared. And then everything after that starts happening on a timer. We found this stuff out, but the bad guys might know we have it. How long do we have to act on it before they're going to close out the things that are about to happen?
Right. And Nikki, are you...
Yeah, I think the thing that I found the most interesting is this is really the first time we've been in Europe, because everything else has been
all around the edges of Europe.
Yeah. So we start in Ireland with a pile of guns on an Irish beach that should not be there, and we all remember Mr. Gaddafi, and he loved to throw money at all kinds of things. And follow, where did that money come from? Where did that money go? Why are there guns on a beach? And it goes from there to Sicily and then to Cyprus, and we'll see where we go from there.
It's almost shades of what becomes later the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare for everybody who loved that movie.
We certainly had the ungentlemanly part covered. I don't think any of the folks, fictionalized or real, were ever as good looking as some of those characters.
Well, there's very little as good looking as Henry Cavill. I will go to my deathbed saying that. Sorry out there.
Yeah, he dirties up so nicely.
Oh, he dirties up nicely. But yes, so honestly, that's cool. When do you think we might see it?
I think it'll be second quarter this year.
Yeah.
By the time it gets out of production.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, I thank you very much. I look forward to reading, and everybody should go out if you enjoy shenanigans on an operative level in strange countries and slogging through mud and seeing what America's been up to. You should definitely read all of L. Douglas Garrett's books, but this one, Remember the Dead, is a really neat prequel to get you going properly. Thank you so much for coming to be here today.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, absolutely.
We will put links to the fascinating things we discussed during this episode on our website. Well, most of it, maybe some of it might be a little bit dodgy, but our website is www.writersdrinkingcoffee.com. You've been listening to Writers Drinking Coffee, a labor of love and enthusiasm put together by the hosts. Our main web magic is cast by Deirdre Schween, and our sound engineer right now is Ksenia Chernyevskaya. Our intro and exit music is provided by Michael Engberg, who lives down under and runs Tin Can Music School. Our podcast sponsors are Jackal Designs, The Bean Street, Arm Street, and hey, I don't know where you're getting your toys these days, but I'm sure they're our sponsor too. And hey, thanks for listening.